So I go home in Whistler, right? And I was dealing with Stars of Davids and all this stuff. I knew that eventually I would have to go to my local church, and I got a Bible, and I started to study it, and I studied it, and I had very amazing experiences at the same time, and I started to study it in details, get different Bibles, different translation, and looked at the text, and I, all of a sudden, I realized that the Bible was not actually what I remembered it to be. Mostly because I was, as a young kid, I was studying the New Testament, but because it was Christian. But I started to read the Old Testament, and it was really amazing. I was reading it, and it didn't seem that my concept of the Hebrew God had been appropriately being interpreted by the Catholic Church, because I was remembering some guy on a throne somewhere with a beer, with a pair of binoculars and a 2x4 waiting for me to screw up, and I was very stressed about that. But the way I was reading the Old Testament, it was quite different. It didn't describe God in such a way. It described it in something much more close to what my studies were about. And I was stunned by that. For instance, in the Bible, you can find the description I've got as some kind of equilateral triangle on a throne, right? It had to do with geometry. And I was stunned by that. I mean, it wasn't an old man considering me as a sinner, but it was some kind of geometry that was described as the throne of God, the point of interaction between human and God. And there was various allusion to it in very specific parts of the Bible. And eventually I saw that they were describing as well these angels that radiated in this tetrahedron, and describing it as like crystal seas and all sorts of things that made me think of technologies and geometries and physics much more than some old guy with a beer on a throne. And I was surprised. That's not what I had remembered. And I continued to study it, and I realized that the Old Testament is ambiguous because the Old Testament described God not as something that's somewhere in the sky or anything. It describes God as an object. It describes that they have some kind of link or communication with God through an object that they call the Ark of the Covenant of God. And they weren't kidding about that. I mean, when you read the Bible and with archaeologists' finds, they actually built one of the largest temples in the world, the Temple of Solomon, to put this object in the middle. It was a very, very large temple with extraordinary large stones. And it was, this ark object had to be shielded from everybody else. And it was enclosed in this Holy of Holies in the center of the Temple of Solomon that was surrounded with concentric walls, very thick walls, in which initiates had to go through very specific initiation level to be able to go from one wall to the other. And only the few could ever go into the Holy of Holies. And they describe all sorts of things that happened if you went in the Holy of Holies or in the tabernacle without having gone through all the appropriate levels of initiation. If you weren't ready, it didn't seem like it was a pretty sight when you came out, right? And if you did. And so I was intrigued with that. I was looking at many of these plates where they showed this arc object, this box that had gold on the outside, gold on the inside, and wood in the middle. And right away I realized that's got to be a capacitor. And sure enough, if you do a box like that, you can generate large capacitance. Capacitors are like batteries. They hold energy. They hold charge. And then the difference between a capacitor and a battery is that a capacitor can discharge extremely rapidly, where a battery cannot. And so capacitors are used in all sorts of electronics today. But basically, there are an electrical, a dielectric, and an electrical plate, which creates like a container for energy. So, and this large arc capacitor was described as having a sphere or a thing in the middle of it that was very radiant. Like they describe how they had to shield themselves from it. And they had to wear very specific clothing to go in there. And that if they didn't, they would come out of there with a sunburn, basically, like burnt into their face, and so on. But then I kind of came across something. What happened is I thought, but wait a minute, they're calling this the Ark of the Covenant of God. And I was like, well, what does God mean? And so I was looking for an answer to that, and I did a lot of research, and I couldn't find exactly, this Yahweh and all this, and I couldn't find exactly, and then eventually I actually just opened the preface of my Bible by error or something. I started reading it, and I found the answer. And it says right here that the name Yahweh, the divine name Yahweh, YHWH, is currently the translation, or is used as the Greek terminology, the tetragrammaton. Now, for a guy like me, when you are reading one of the most, sacred books on the planet, I guess, and the person is describing God, and the translation is tetragrammaton, okay? I'm starting to have ideas. Can you, okay. You guys probably can see where I'm going there, right? I was stunned. Imagine that. Every time you read the word God in the Bible, you could translate tetragrammaton. So you could replace all the gods and lords in the Bible to tetragrammaton. And then you get a really different reading. Okay? It's like, oh my tetragrammaton. And so I looked at the etymology of this, and I thought, well, the word tetragrammaton is typically